What happens in the human psyche when you go silent after rejection? Not out of vengeance, not out of bitterness, but as a quiet withdrawal into your own center. Today, we dive into the strange and powerful reaction that silence creates in those who once turned you away. You will understand the hidden emotional forces you awaken in others when you stop chasing and start observing. Stay with us until the end, because this is not about games. It's about self-possession, inner wholeness, and the unconscious chaos your stillness can unleash in the very person who rejected you. In the human psyche, silence is not merely the absence of speech. It is a profound presence, a symbolic force that communicates in ways the conscious mind cannot always grasp. When you respond to rejection not with anger, pleading, or persuasion, but with silence, you create a vacuum. And within that vacuum, the unconscious of the other begins to stir. This is not a strategy or manipulation, but a deep psychological truth. People are not disturbed by silence because of what it says, because of what it reveals within themselves. To understand this, one must recognize that rejection is rarely about the object being rejected. It is often about the internal conflicts and projections residing within the one who does the rejecting. When a person dismisses you, distances themselves from you, or undervalues your presence, they are often responding not solely to you, but to something unresolved within them. A fear of intimacy, a wounded ego, an unmet expectation they projected onto you. When you meet this rejection not with resistance, but with silence, you remove the external distraction. You become a mirror in which they can only see themselves. And this is where the unconscious begins to awaken. The silence forces the rejected to face what they avoided by rejecting you in the first place. Your absence denies them the ability to externalize their discomfort. There is no longer a convenient target for blame, no emotional drama to distract from the real source of their tension. Their mind begins to turn inward, often unwillingly, and the shadows they refuse to confront now begin to take shape. Silence, then, is the invitation to introspection. Not a gentle one, but a piercing one. It is like a still lake in which the other is forced to gaze, only to discover that the reflection staring back is not yours, it is theirs. Their choices, their wounds, their unhealed attachments, their fragile ego structures, they come into focus. Your silence, paradoxically, speaks the loudest here. It does not offer them comfort. It does not affirm their self-righteousness. It simply leaves them alone with the noise they tried to suppress. In the analytical language of depth psychology, what occurs is a confrontation with the shadow, the repressed, denied, or unacknowledged aspects of the self. When you go silent, you do not disappear. You become a symbolic presence. You become the ghost of meaning they tried to discard but cannot unsee. The very thing they thought they did not need begins to haunt them. Not because of who you are, but because of what you represent, the part of themselves they tried to dominate or reject. Many people do not understand how silence can disturb more than words. Words can be debated, explained, or dismissed. Silence is the one response that cannot be controlled or refuted. It forces the psyche into a state of listening, and for many, this is unbearable. They feel something shifting in the dark, in a place inside them that reason cannot touch. The unconscious does not speak in language. It speaks in anxiety, in dreams, in irrational guilt or longing. Your silence becomes the catalyst for these unconscious eruptions. And so, the person who once felt powerful in their rejection begins to feel uncertain. The structure they built to justify their choice begins to crack. Because you have not reinforced their narrative with reaction, they are now left to construct meaning in a void. And the human psyche detests a void, rushes to fill it, with fantasy, with regret, with stories that explain your disappearance, with projections that rationalize your calm. This is why often, the rejecting person will begin to imagine what you are thinking, where you are, what you are doing. They cannot escape you now because they are imagining you more vividly than they experienced you when you were present. You have moved from being a known quantity to becoming an archetype. The silent, sovereign figure who did not plead, did not chase, did not collapse under the weight of rejection. You become mystery. And mystery awakens something primal in the psyche. It calls forth questions that were buried under certainty. It calls forth longing that was veiled beneath indifference. It forces the rejecting ego to confront the possibility that it misunderstood you, underestimated you, or perhaps most painfully, projected its own flaws onto you. Rejection, in its surface expression, appears as a definitive act, an assertion of boundaries, a dismissal of connection, or the refusal of further emotional investment. But beneath the surface, it often conceals a deeper psychological mechanism. When a person rejects another, especially someone who was once a source of attention, care, or emotional intensity, they do not always do so from a place of strength. More often, They do it to escape the psychological mirror the other person unconsciously holds up to them. But that mirror is not so easily shattered, because when you respond to rejection with silence rather than resistance, what you awaken in the other is not just discomfort. You awaken the very shadow they tried to bury. The shadow, in Jungian terms, is the hidden side of the psyche, the suppressed emotions, disowned traits, and unresolved conflicts that the ego cannot or will not integrate. It is everything a person denies about themselves, but is nonetheless always present, lurking in the unconscious. When someone rejects you, particularly if you offered them emotional honesty, depth, or vulnerability, they are often rejecting an encounter with their own shadow. Your presence, your depth, reflected back to them the parts of themselves they weren't ready to face. So they push you away. They remove the external trigger, assuming that will restore their inner balance. But when your reaction is not desperation nor argument, nor even visible pain, but silence, pure grounded, self-possessed silence, then something shifts. Their ego, which expected confirmation of its control, receives nothing, no validation, no conflict, no emotional reward. And in that stillness, the rejected person is left with themselves. And what they meet in that silence is the shadow they thought they had exiled, because rejection does not eliminate projection. It only delays its confrontation. When someone pushes you away to avoid facing their own chaos, they believe they are preserving order. But your silence begins to erode that illusion. Without your energy to absorb or distract them, the psychic material they were running from returns, more vividly than ever. Regret, confusion, suppressed guilt, unacknowledged longing, all begin to emerge, not because you demanded they surface, but because you cease to interfere with their own internal reckoning. In this way, silence becomes more than a response. It becomes a psychological crucible. It becomes the dark chamber in which the rejected soul must finally sit with what they are. Your silence reintroduces them to their own emptiness, to the stories they told themselves about power, love, and worth, to the parts of themselves they project onto others so they don't have to carry them. Without your words to blame, your presence to resist, your warmth to feed off, there is only the shadow, and it becomes louder with every passing day. The more self-aware among them will feel this as anxiety, emotional restlessness, or dreams that trouble their sleep. Those less aware will feel it as irrational anger, blame, or a sudden desire to reach back out, not in love, in desperation to silence the shadow again. Because you were not just a person to them, you were a symbol. And in rejecting you, they thought they could reject the parts of themselves you illuminated. But when you do not return to fulfill that illusion, when you remain silent, their unconscious begins to suspect the truth. The problem was never only outside. In relationships, people often seek what they lack within. They are drawn to traits, emotions, or values they themselves have not integrated. And when they find them in another, it either invites admiration or deep resentment, because to be close to someone who embodies what you have disowned is both exhilarating and terrifying. If they cannot accept what you mirror to them, they will push you away. But if you respond not with protest, but with stillness, you create the exact psychological environment where that confrontation must happen. Not externally, but internally. This is why your silence is powerful beyond what words can achieve. Because it holds the space that allows their unconscious to rise. It awakens the dormant parts of their psyche, not through conflict, but through absence, through what is no longer available to project upon. And in that awakening, the rejected person faces something far more difficult than your presence. They face the truth of themselves. When an individual chooses to reject someone, especially one who offered them authentic emotional presence, what they reveal is not always clarity or confidence. More often, they reveal the underdeveloped nature of their emotional world, one governed not by integration, but by avoidance. In psychological terms, this is emotional immaturity. It does not necessarily mean a lack of intelligence or life experience, but rather the absence of a deeply rooted relationship with one's inner life. And nothing reveals this more starkly than your refusal to respond with neediness or confrontation. Your silence becomes a diagnostic instrument. It exposes where their emotional growth ended. The emotionally immature person often seeks control over their emotional environment, not out of malicious intent, but because they do not know how to sit with discomfort. They avoid difficult conversations, resist vulnerability, and push away anything that threatens their carefully guarded self-image. When you offer vulnerability, when you approach with openness or sincerity, they experience this not as connection, but as a threat. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you reminded them of what they've never learned to navigate. Intimacy is foreign to the emotionally stunted psyche. It feels overwhelming, even dangerous, because it threatens to unmask what they've spent years suppressing, so they reject you or distance themselves, not as a considered decision born from awareness, but as a reflex, a defense mechanism. They may justify it with logic, stories about incompatibility or independence, but beneath the surface, it is an avoidance of emotional complexity. And this is where your silence, your dignified withdrawal, becomes a mirror they cannot bear to look into. Because you do not play their game. You do not beg for answers. You do not try to reinsert yourself. You simply disappear, and in doing so, you force them to confront the absence of emotional maturity they spent their lives trying to hide. In Jungian psychology, we often speak of individuation, the process of becoming whole, of integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of the psyche. Emotional maturity is an integral part of this process. It involves the ability to hold tension, to sit with paradox, to accept one's own darkness without projecting it onto others. The emotionally immature cannot do this. They split their emotions into good and bad, safe and unsafe, lovable and unlovable. When you reflect to them something they have not accepted in themselves, depth, truth, vulnerability, they feel exposed. And when you respond to their rejection with silence rather than collapse, it highlights the very maturity they lack. You become a symbol of what they were not ready for, not because you were too much, but because they were too little. Your stillness, your calm, your refusal to react. These are the behaviors of someone who has walked further along the path of self-awareness. And in contrast, their emotional fragility is amplified. The silence you hold does not accuse them, but it speaks louder than any confrontation. It reveals who is capable of standing in the fire of emotion without burning, and who must run from the heat. As time passes, this silence begins to act like a psychic pressure. The emotionally immature mind starts to spiral, not because you are doing anything, but because they cannot understand your absence. They cannot comprehend why you are not orbiting their world anymore. This dissonance exposes the shallowness of their emotional architecture. They expect a chase. They expect to be validated in their rejection. They expect drama, reaction, collapse, all the things they understand. But when none of these come, they are left with a void, and within that void, the truth becomes undeniable. They were never emotionally equipped to handle someone like you. It is not uncommon for the emotionally immature to attempt re-entry, not out of love, but out of confusion. Your silence unsettles them. It triggers a crisis because it disrupts the feedback loop they rely on to feel in control. They may reach out not with apology, but with bait, sarcasm, or shallow questions. It is not your attention they truly want. It is the relief of not having to feel the weight of their own inadequacy. But the silence you maintain continues to reveal the truth. They were never rejecting you. They were rejecting the part of themselves that could not match your emotional depth. Power is not always loud. It is not always found in dominance, assertion, or displays of strength. True psychological power is often found in silence, particularly in the silence that follows rejection. Most people misunderstand rejection. They believe the one who walks away or dismisses holds the upper hand. That to reject is to dominate the narrative. But this illusion only holds when the rejected begs, pleads, or attempts to restore the bond. The moment you respond with calm, unshakable silence, the dynamic begins to shift. And though the one who rejected you may not fully understand what's happening, they feel it deeply, internally, as a quiet panic that begins to grow in their unconscious. The one who leaves expects reaction. The ego craves confirmation that it still holds emotional influence. It waits for the message, the confession, the attempt to negotiate the pain. But when it is met with nothing, no resistance, no confrontation, no attempt to reclaim connection, a different kind of reaction begins. The person starts to sense that the emotional leverage they assumed was theirs is slipping. They cannot quite name it, but they feel it. And what they feel is a loss of power they believed they had secured. In Jungian thought, this shift of power is not just external. It reflects a deeper movement within the psyche. The balance between persona and shadow, between the conscious mask and the unconscious truth, begins to tremble. The one who maintains silence becomes, in the eyes of the other, an unknown, an enigma. And the human mind fears the unknown more than it fears pain, because pain is predictable. It fits into a pattern. But silence breeds uncertainty. It creates a void into which all suppressed doubts, insecurities, and unresolved feelings rush like water filling an empty chamber. They begin to question what they were once certain about. Was the rejection justified? Did they misjudge the connection? Was the other person stronger, more aware, more in control than they appeared? These questions do not arise from rational analysis. They arise from the shift of emotional power. And because it happens beneath the surface of conscious awareness, it creates a feeling of imbalance. Something feels wrong, but they cannot say what. All they know is that the dynamic has changed, and they are no longer sure who is leading it. Your silence becomes a gravitational pull, not because it is manipulative, but because it is sovereign. It does not chase, it does not explain, it does not seek approval or closure, it simply is. And in being so, it reveals the difference between external control and internal strength. The person who rejected you may have had control over the moment, over the choice, over the event. But you have control over the self. You do not collapse. You do not perform. You hold your posture, and that is terrifying to someone who relies on emotional reactions to feel secure in their identity. Power, in its truest form, is felt not when you dominate others, but when you no longer need to. When your absence becomes louder than your presence ever was, when your silence forces reflection, and when your lack of pursuit begins to echo louder than any words you could have spoken, that is when the power shifts. And that shift is psychological. It touches something primal in the other person. It exposes the fragility of their assumptions. It reminds them that control is never truly owned. It is given, and you have ceased to give it. They cannot explain this with logic. They will not confess it in words, but their behavior changes. Sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. They may start watching, checking, sending vague signals, or suddenly trying to reassert the dynamic. Not because they have resolved anything within themselves, because they sense the balance has tilted. You, the one who was supposedly cast aside, now possess the calm they cannot replicate, and that calm becomes a mirror reflecting their unrest. Your silence, far from being passive, radiates a message their psyche cannot ignore. The energy has shifted, and they no longer hold the power they once believed was theirs. Rejection is rarely about the present moment. It is almost always about the unresolved echoes of the past. When someone pushes away a person who offered depth, sincerity, or vulnerability, what they are truly reacting to is often hidden beneath the surface of consciousness. It is not about you, not in the way most assume. It is about them. Their past, their suppressed memories, their unhealed emotional wounds that were stirred, not because you did anything wrong, but because your presence, your calmness, your steadiness, your refusal to conform, was too close to the truth they've been avoiding their entire lives. Every human being carries an unconscious storehouse of emotional imprints, what Jung called the shadow. These are the forgotten injuries, neglected needs, and buried fears that were too overwhelming for the child to process. As we grow older, we construct identities to protect ourselves from these shadow contents. We wear masks, perform roles. We pursue relationships not always for love, but for validation, proof that we are not as broken as we secretly fear. But the problem is, unconscious never forgets. And when someone enters our life who refuses to mirror our illusions, who quietly represents authenticity, emotional clarity, and presence, shadow becomes agitated. Your absence does not simply represent a person who is no longer present. It becomes symbolic. It becomes a reminder of what they lost, what they ran from, what they never allowed themselves to fully feel. When you walk away without bitterness, without blame, without rage, their mind has no story to defend itself with. There is no villain to hate. There is no chaos to pin on you. There is only silence, and that silence gives birth to reflection. The unconscious begins to stir, and in that stirring, they begin to feel not only the loss of you, but the awakening of wounds long buried. This is why your silence becomes so powerful. It is not just the absence of noise. It is the presence of something ancient, something internal. It bypasses the ego, the part of the psyche that loves to rationalize an excuse, and it goes straight to the emotional core. Perhaps they were abandoned as children. They were taught that love is dangerous, that vulnerability leads to pain, that closeness equals betrayal. Whatever their specific history, your stillness acts like a psychic trigger, causing those wounds to open again, not by force but by contrast. Your maturity reflects their avoidance. Your restraint reflects their panic. Your absence forces them into a space they have spent years trying to avoid, the inner world of unresolved suffering. They may try to escape this sensation. Some distract themselves with other people, dive into work, or manufacture a narrative where you were never that important. None of it works for long, because pain rooted in the unconscious is not rational. It cannot be reasoned away or outperformed. It demands attention, and it waits patiently. And when there is nothing left to distract them, when the noise quiets, they feel it. Not the absence of a partner, but the surfacing of a forgotten part of themselves they cannot name. In this sense, you were never just a romantic figure or a friend. You were a psychological catalyst, not by intention but by being. And when you removed yourself without explanation or performance, your absence became a kind of spiritual provocation. You didn't abandon them. They were already abandoned long before you arrived. You simply stopped filling the space they never learned to fill for themselves, and now they feel the full weight of that space. It's not a longing for you as a person. It's a longing for the wholeness your presence briefly offered. Your absence is now a wound they do not understand because they have spent their entire life denying it existed. You touched a part of them that predates logic, that existed before language, before adult defenses were formed. And now that you're gone, they can no longer ignore that part. It bleeds in silence. Its ache is without clarity, and that ache is the shadow, finally speaking, not because it wants revenge or resolution, but because it has always wanted to be seen. We often believe that presence is the most powerful act of influence. That to be seen, to be heard, to be known is how we shape the lives of others. But what we fail to understand is that sometimes it is our absence, calm, deliberate, and dignified, that reaches deepest into the unconscious of those who once dismissed us. Silence is not emptiness. It is a mirror. And in its stillness, others are forced to confront not only the void left behind, but the truths they buried long before you arrived. When a person walks away from you, not because of chaos, but because they underestimated your worth, they expect emotional pursuit. They expect the ego to beg for return, for closure, for clarity. But when instead they are met with unwavering silence, a silent storm brews within them. Not because they miss you in the way they think, but because your absence has disrupted their illusions. It has exposed something deeper. Something within them that was never resolved. Every calm withdrawal from a toxic or immature dynamic leaves behind a residue. That residue is not your emotion, it is theirs. It is their projection, their denial, their inability to process what your stability represents. You were not chaotic, you were not cruel. You were simply present, and that presence unsettled the foundation of a self built on fear, avoidance, and emotional fragmentation. When you left, you did not create the emptiness. You simply stopped filling it. The power they feel slipping away was never yours to give. It was an illusion they held when they believed they could control how you felt about yourself. When they see you thriving in silence, detached, grounded, unaffected by their withdrawal, they are left to deal with the part of themselves they have long abandoned. You become a myth in their psyche, part memory, part symbol, part unresolved question. Not because you aimed to haunt them, but because your existence awakened something they weren't ready to meet. This is not about vengeance. It is about sovereignty. To walk away quietly, without fanfare or performance, is the highest form of psychological discipline. You no longer participate in someone else's projections. You no longer fuel their illusions. You leave behind a void filled only by their own shadow. Let them feel the discomfort. Let them wrestle with the silence. Not because you wish them harm, but because it is the only space where growth begins. Pain that is ignored becomes personality. Pain that is faced becomes transformation. And in that space, where your absence echoes louder than any words, you become not a memory but a mirror to their lost self, a mirror to their forgotten truth, a mirror to the kind of love, stability, and presence they never learned to accept. And in doing so, your silence becomes your greatest legacy.